is equal to sine over cosine. Do you remember that cosecant is 1 over sine? Do you remember that secant is 1 over cosine? Do you remember that cotangent is cosine over sine? That's what we practiced yesterday. So this is a big question. Do you have to remember this for the test? You get to use the sheet of notes, so you don't have to remember it. However, I will say that if you ask me, what are the types of people who do better on the test? The people who don't have to look at their sheet all the time, they definitely do better. So I would encourage you to try to remember that a little bit. Okay, so you have 3 equations that we're learning today, and we are going to derive some things from it, and that will kind of end our simplifying trigonometric expressions piece. But this is one of the most important equations that you can learn altogether. Sine squared plus cosine squared is 1. Now, do you guys have a calculator?
Yeah.
If you have a calculator, take it out. Josh, give me a number 1 through 50. 44. Watch what we do. If I take sine of 44 and I square it, and I add it to cosine of 44, and I square it, look at what I get. Dakota, give me a number 1 through 50. Okay, we'll just change it a little bit. I'm going to go and change that 44. I'll change it to a 43. Burke, give me any number at all. I don't care what it is. Positive, negative, anywhere.
69.
I knew you were going to do that. That's why I said 1 through 50. Okay, so we're going to do sine of 1,458.32, and I'm going to square it, and I'm going to add it to cosine of 1,458.32, and I will square it, and look at what I get. It doesn't matter what it is that you plug in, it will end up being 1 if you square sine and you square cosine. Now, we can end up with a couple other equations that come from this. What if I subtracted cosine squared from both sides? What would remain on the right-hand side, or on the left-hand side? Sine squared of x. What remains on the left-hand side, or the right-hand side? 1 minus cosine squared of x. So what I've done is I've taken some of those and I've placed them right here for you as we kind of change them. Let's do another one. Suppose I subtract, instead of subtracting cosine squared, suppose I subtracted sine squared of x from both sides. What would remain on the left-hand side? Cosine squared of x. And what's on the right-hand side then? 1 minus sine squared. Those are 3 formulas that you really, really want to know. It turns out that just like we came up with this formula, there's 2 others that we come up with as well. 1 plus tangent squared is secant squared, and 1 plus cotangent squared is cosecant squared. And I've shown the different ways in which you can maneuver those to get new formulas. We're not going to use all of them, but we will use a few. And so you're going to want to have this sheet handy as we go through this set of notes right here. And we start right here. In order to simplify this, we're not going to entirely rewrite it in terms of sine and cosine as we start. What we're going to do is we're going to actually substitute something in. From what we just wrote, do people remember what 1 minus cosine squared is? Oh, let's look at our sheet. 1 minus cosine squared. Can anybody find it? What is 1 minus cosine squared? Sine squared. So instead of writing 1 minus cosine squared, we're going to put sine squared in its place. So this guy right here becomes sine squared of theta. Now the problem is very similar to what we did yesterday. I'll rewrite in terms of sine and cosine. So sine squared of theta over 1 times, anybody remember how I rewrite cosecant? 1 over sine. What's going to happen? Yep, so you end up with just sine of theta. And we're going to have to pay attention the second time. I see secant squared minus 1. Let's look at our sheet. Do you see a spot where there's a secant squared minus 1? Yeah. Where? It is right here. Secant squared minus 1 is tangent squared. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this and put in its place tangent squared. Kachi, do you see where we got that? Your sheet says secant squared minus 1 is tangent squared. Okay, now I rewrite it in terms of sine and cosine. What happens? Cosine squareds cancel. You get sine squared. Let's look at number 3. I've got secant squared minus 1. What did we just say secant squared minus 1 was? So I have tangent squared over sine squared. Very good. If I want to simplify this, I'm going to write it as a fraction. Tangent squared can be rewritten as sine squared over cosine squared. And then how do I rewrite the bottom? Sine squared over 1. How do I divide fractions? By the reciprocal. So the reciprocal is going to be 1 over sine squared. What happens? And from yesterday, what is 1 over cosine? So I have secant squared of theta. If you look at number 4, it doesn't look like you can readily substitute something in. And so we're going to do something different. We're actually going to factor. People struggle to see this factoring, so here's what I'm going to write for you. Suppose we have x squared minus x squared times y squared. Take 30 seconds and see if you can factor this with your friends. Go. Okay, let's check it out. Did you factor it like that? We didn't know how to factor that? What? So these each have a factor of x squared, common factor, so I just factored out an x squared. You see that? So let's look at this. What common factor do both of these terms have? I've got one in red and I've got one in blue. What do they both have? A tangent squared. So I'm going to take out a tangent squared. And what am I left with when I take out a tangent squared? 1 minus sine squared. Now this becomes a problem just like what we did. What is 1 minus sine squared? Good. So I have tangent squared times cosine squared. Now I have tangent squared. I can rewrite as sine squared over cosine squared. And I'm going to multiply that by cosine squared over 1. Those cancel, giving me sine squared. Yes? So, what is the common factor that sits in the red and the blue term? Sine squared. So I will factor out the sine squared. Excellent. Secant squared of theta minus 1. So let's pause. Anybody have questions how I got in that step? Okay, so now you hopefully recognize by looking at the sheet what is secant squared minus 1. This sheet right here says secant squared minus 1 is tangent squared. So I go back to my sheet, and instead of secant squared minus 1, what do I write in its place? I write tangent squared. Maybe something simplifies there. So I will write sine squared of theta over 1 times, and Aiden right now is rewriting tangent to be what? Sine squared over cosine squared. Does anything cancel? So did rewriting this help me in this situation? So actually, this is as simplified as it gets. So sometimes you come out with a nice kind of singular representation. Sometimes it might be 2 pieces. You try number 6 on your own. What are you going to factor out in number 6? Factor out cosine squared. See what you come up with. Go. Let's check. You factor out the cosine squared, and you should be left with 1 plus tangent squared. What? Go ahead. What is 1 plus tangent squared? Ask it, Burke. I would love to answer the question. Okay, so when I factor out that, I get 1 plus tangent squared. Does anybody see that on their sheet? Okay, it's right here, right? 1 plus tangent squared is secant squared. And you guys, you're not supposed to just absorb this in 3 minutes. This is something where you're going to have to take some time, look at it. It's not going to be instantaneous. So I have cosine squared of theta times secant squared of theta. Hey, what's the relationship between cosine and secant? They're reciprocals, right? What happens if you multiply reciprocals? Yeah, so here we have cosine squared of theta over 1 times, how do I rewrite secant? 1 over cosine squared. So we said that they are reciprocals, so when we multiply them, we should see that those would cancel and simply give us 1. I bet you could do 7 on your own. Try 7 on your own. Go. Okay, did everybody get number 7? Well, I didn't give you a lot of time because what is secant squared minus 1? Tangent squared. And what's tangent squared over tangent squared? Yeah. Well, secant squared minus 1 is, and so you have that over that. Those are the same things, so you get 1. Yep. Okay, so why is secant squared minus 1, why is that equal to tangent squared? As you look right here, so this is the key that people are kind of asking is, where do I go when? When you see a secant squared and a 1, Do you think you start looking at formula 5, 6, or 7? If you see secant squared and 1, do you look at 5, 6, or 7? Yeah, you definitely look at 6. And so when you look at 6, now you're looking to find secant squared minus 1 somewhere. I don't see it here. I don't see it here, but I do see it right there. That help a little bit? Okay. Let's see if we're done. We're going to do one more. We're going to do problem number 11. So sometimes, instead of factoring, you can actually multiply something out and see something take place. So I'm going to multiply this out and see what happens. What's 1 times 1? 1. And then what's 1 times cosine? So I have plus cosine of theta. And I have negative cosine times 1. Negative cosine of theta. And then I have negative cosine times positive cosine. Negative cosine squared. Okay. So what happens from what I just did? The cosine and the negative cosine go away. Yep, the middles will cancel, leaving you with what? And Josh is now going to tell us what that is equal to. Okay, so let's... How did you know that, Josh? Thank you, Aiden. So when Josh sees a 1 and a cosine squared, he knows he's drawn to which formula? 5, 6, or 7? He's drawn to 5. And so he's looking for a 1 minus cosine squared. And he can see it right here that's equal to sine squared. So the answer is cosine squared, or sine squared, excuse me. Yep. So this should not just be like, I automatically remember all the formulas. Remember, I'm not making you memorize every single one, but you have to get used to where you're looking on your sheet and how you're simplifying that. So I have the answer key ready to go for your first 2 worksheets. You are just working on the second one right now. If you want to check your first one, you can come on up here and I can show that to you.